Okay, welcome back, everyone. This is going to be chapter 2 in the Birch Hill book. This is the chapter on realism by Jack Donnelly. These, excuse me, geez. These next few lectures are going to be kind of huge. Like, this is the meat of international relations. These are the enormous sort of global lenses through which we see international relations and debate international relations and try to make predictions about state behaviors and things like that. So, realism and liberalism are the two main theories in all of international relations. So, I'm going to hit these pretty hard. Okay, let's jump in to section one, the introduction, the definition of realism. And they say, I'm going to quote them because I usually try to quote definitions. In international relations, political realism is a tradition of analysis that stresses the imperative states face to pursue a power politics of the national interest. And there are some assumptions of realism, including anarchy, human behavior, etc., which we'll talk about. Um, this is sort of the original theory of international relations. This is the theory around historically the way that state leaders have seen how they need to behave in international relations. And so, if you read things like the Peloponnesian Wars and the Melian Dialogue, and there's a really famous quote about like powerful states do what they want, and other states submit, right? And some of that idea is coming back onto the scene as we see sort of a more stringent, realist, what would you even call it, zero sum political system in the sort of modern era over the last 15 years or so. All right, section two, defining realism. There's two real basic assumptions to this. The first is egoism or human selfishness. The idea is that individuals and states act quote unquote rationally to maximize their own power and security. So this is very Machiavellian. It's very Thomas Hobbes, right? Life is short, brutish, and nasty. Everybody, if we were in a state of anarchy, it would be either the strong survive and sort of predate on the weak. The second assumption of realism is anarchy. And again, anarchy is not chaos like in the sort of normal parlance sense that we use it. Anarchy just means there's no sort of operating international body, right? There's no international organization or supranational organization that could really hold anyone to account, right? If you decide to break the international rules, even when there are international rules, the UN isn't going to step in with the blue hats and, like, I don't know, arrest Keir Starmer or whichever, like, sort of Western leader or whatever. Yes, there have been some arrests from like the ICJ and stuff, but as we'll talk about later, those tend to be um, from non-Western states and tend to be from developing states. Okay, some famous realists over time. I think everyone sort of agrees that Thucydides can be considered the first, realist thinker. There have been some modern ideas that he's not as realist as people were suggesting he was historically, but that's besides the point. Niccolo Machiavelli. If you play the Assassin's Creed Ezio campaign, you get to meet Machiavelli. And he's the one basically who says, if you're a leader, do you want your people to love you or fear you? And he says both, but if you could only pick one, let's pick fear. You've got Thomas Hobbes, who says that humans are basically inherently selfish and evil, and that if there is no sort of Leviathan, he calls it, right, the state, if there is no state to make people behave, then you'll just see predation and violence and stuff like that. You've got Kenneth Waltz, who I think was the offensive realism guy from like the 1950s and 60s. He was really he worked with like the FBI. and a lot of foreign think tanks and international organizations and the US government, all of these sorts of things. Hans Morgenthau was a defensive realist from Germany, and then John Mearsheimer. So, just a list of, like, if you're going to look for some realist literature, these six would be an excellent place to start. All right, an important quote that I found. Uh, who is the author? The author's name is Jack Donnelly. So Jack says, statesmanship thus involved mitigating and managing, not eliminating conflict, seeking a less dangerous world rather than a safe, just, or peaceful one. Ethical decisions must give way to the reasons of the state or the raison d'etat. Um, so this was some of the earlier thinking about realism. Was that just like human beings under Thomas Hobbes's conception, states are just as power maximizing, security maximizing, whatever you want to call it. States are naturally conflictual, not peaceful, right? And we'll talk about when we get to liberalism arguments about that idea. But a lot of that is sort of at the core of what realism is. We've got a couple of different types of realism. You've got the classical realism of Thomas Hobbes and Morgenthau. And this is basically the idea that of those two assumptions, anarchy and human egoism is the one we want to lean on, right? And they say it's basically human nature that drives conflict, territoriality, war, colonialism, all of this sort of stuff. On the other end, you have sort of what I think of as structural realism. They call it neo-realism, but I think structural sort of defines the idea far better. And this is just the idea that, again, of those two assumptions, egoism, anarchy, this side leans toward the anarchy, the systemic structural system and the incentives that offers to states as actors. And so they're the ones who say anarchy at the international level is what drives conflict. Um, these are the guys that say, it's about security maximization. You start to get arms spirals, even, if you're building defensive weapons and you have no intention to go to war, sort of distrust and misunderstanding of each other's intentions. And the anarchic system forces you into conflict. And that even when leaders want peace domestically, anarchy prevents that from happening. Okay, let's move on to section 3. We'll talk about Hobbes and classical realism. So, some of you have probably taken my political philosophy class, and so we've covered a lot of sort of the Leviathan and Thomas Hobbes's thoughts. This is right around the English Civil War period, and Thomas Hobbes is sort of defining what a state should look like, why citizens should want a state, what is the relationship of the citizen to the king as unto, humans unto God, basically. Um, what is the nature of man and their sinfulness and evil and greed and sort of these sorts of things, right? And so Thomas Hobbes focuses a lot on the human mind and human nature and how it causes conflict. And he basically tries to lay out what he sees as the state of man before governance, before there is police or a king or whatever. So this is the analogy to anarchy in the international system, right? And he says basically strength is all that matters in that kind of world. The strong will abuse the weak. He has the famous line that life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short for all but the most powerful, right? Whether that be financial power, but especially physical power or the power to sort of lead, a group behind you, these sorts of things. And as we will see later in the semester, even sort of defending oneself by just preparing for conflict for defense can lead to the sort of arms spiral and can lead to preemptive wars, can lead to arms races, misunderstandings of each other's intentions, etc. This reading is highly lauded by realists, right? This is much of the modern core. Yes, we do have Thucydides and Machiavelli, but many think that, at least of the classical realists, that Thomas Hobbes is really the closest to the core essence of what the international system looks like through the analogy of human nature. However, not everyone agrees with this reading, right? Um, you know, even like Christian doctrine and stuff says that like there is good in people, right? There is naturally good in people. Like not everything is going to break down into anarchy just because no one's looking at you all the time. The sort of Santa Claus argument, right? And Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote a response to Thomas Hobbes saying, no, 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 that's not human nature. Like human nature is good and kind and just, and sharing and communal, and government is kind of what fucked all this up and made us greedy, right, and warlike and stuff. So, we'll get into that in the next chapter, but just know that not everyone agrees with Thomas Hobbes that like humans are inherently just terrible, right? And then I would also say like Woodrow Wilson would deeply disagree, right? The guy who built the League of Nations. Um, he was like our only political scientist president of the United States, and he would deeply disagree. Most of the liberal sort of wing would disagree with this idea of the human nature and conflict is just natural, right? Okay. Section 4, assessing Hobbesian realism. One of Hobbes's assumptions that all men are one of Hobbes's assumptions is that all men are sort of equally capable of influencing the system, um, and that it's all sort of about power aggregation, right? And uh, since we all have sort of equal qualities, we'll never want someone else to have more than us. It's a hard sort of argument to break down. It's also very questionable, right? Like inequalities exist, inequalities in finances, in background, in education, in all kinds of things, and inequalities exist across the international system too when we're talking about states as actors. Nobody would probably, very few, I guess, would say that, like, I don't know, Papua New Guinea is on the same level of influence as the United States of America in the international system, right? Um, and so it's kind of it starts to crumble as an argument. Let's see. And so many of the sort of modern neo-realists or structural realists, um, they start talking about great power competition, right? Where this anarchic system does mean that we have to test each other all the time. We have to have relative advantages over other states. We have to prepare for conflict. We can't lean on a supranational organization to sort of hold people by the rules, but it's only the great powers who play that game, and the rest have to just sort of line up, right? And so we'll talk about balance of powers and bilateralism and all of these sorts of things. Bipolar systems, I'm sorry. Okay, let's move on to section 5, Waltz and structural realism. So we talked about Kenneth Waltz a little bit earlier. He's a big proponent of the structural model. This is when sort of behavioral economics starts to move a lot more into political science. You got to remember, political science and economics are very nascent fields, maybe around a century and a half, um, maybe 2 centuries, right? But especially sort of modern economic thought, not Adam Smith, but Keynes, and then the modern sort of realist thought that comes out of behavioral economics is only around 80 years old or so, maybe 90. Okay, so modern structuralism is far more focused on anarchy and far less focused on human nature like Thomas Hobbes and Machiavelli, etc. And there are really two assumed state of plays under the structural model. You have either an anarchic system or you have a hierarchic system, like we have in sort of domestic politics, right? And it's basically just about the relationship of authority and subordination, which is the hierarchical system, or anarchy, which is like sort of an even board. And they say if all international orders are anarchic, and this implies minimal functional difference, then international political structures differ only in distribution of capabilities. So, this is the neo realist model. It's all about capabilities, it's all about relative advantage compared to others. It's what we call the zero sum game, right? We're not worried about all ships rising. We're worried about our ship rising way more than yours, right? Um, and they say they're defined by changing fates of great powers. And so this is where we start to really bring in the bipolar versus hegemonic system or tripolar systems or balancing alliances, all of these sorts of thoughts. It's not about human nature, it's about just the structural anarchy of the system. Okay, so let's move to section 5A. This is balancing. Under the structural argument or the neo-realist argument, since we have anarchy, a balancing behavior is the most likely state behavior, right? Especially if you are not one of the very, very few great powers in the system. And so what you'll tend to get is a balancing of alliances so that you get relative parity over time. And you're not going to get a bandwagoning system. So we basically we balance our risk because if we allow some great power to become the end all be all, eventually they could turn around and abuse us, right? As arguably we might be seeing in the world scene right now, both from China and from the United States. And you can point to numerous balance of power periods in history. And what a lot of this argument revolves around is the idea that as it gets out of balance, or as you start to see, say, we do have a split a little bit, and one of the alliance systems starts to come up, or one state starts to come up and challenge the hegemonic system, that you're going to get war, right? And so we can sort of see that with World War One, when you get sort of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the rise of the Central Axis. You can see it in the collapse into World War Two, as Germany starts to rise and challenge the sort of Western philosophy, France, England, the United States. You see the Cold War, where you get a really tense balance between the two. Um, and there are conflicts to ensure that the Soviets do not pass the Americans or that the Americans fall back behind the Soviets, right? So you get all of these proxy wars, you get nuclear proliferation. And then finally, I guess in contemporary times, I would say some theorists are saying that this is China. This is the future. That China is rising. They are becoming a competitive power, and so inevitably um, one of the two great powers is going to lash out at each other, either so that China can eventually surpass the United States, or so that the United States can ensure that China does not surpass them, right? And so a lot of sort of neo-realist thinkers are suggesting that we are going to see conflict in the sort of short to medium term with China as they rise and rise and rise, and as the U.S. is sort of at least overall proportional power on the global stage sort of diminishes. Okay, section 5B, the prisoner's dilemma. I would ask you to pause it for just a moment. Actually, you know what? I'm going to pop this little dude in there. Um, and so it'll be in your announcements. If you look at the player game, the prisoner's dilemma, you can kind of see this really simplified version of the the difficult situation states find themselves in. And I'll just break down what is the prisoner's dilemma, and then I'll talk to you about the analogy. So assume two guys get arrested together. They get locked up in separate rooms. They can't sort of talk about what we are going to say to each other, right? The cops go in and they're interrogating both. And they say, there's two choices here. You can either confess and we'll cut your sentence, or you don't confess and your buddy will, and you'll take the brunt of it, right? And so if you both confess, you both serve 6 years. If both of you keep your damn mouths shut, you only serve a single year. If one of you holds out, the one who does sort of snitch, I guess, or confesses, gets to walk away free, and the other who refused to do so serves 10 years, right? And so your absolute worst payoff is by shutting your mouth. Um, and since there's no way to coordinate, you cannot guarantee that the other prisoner isn't going to confess. And so you have this weird, distorted incentive system to talk, right? And and that means you're both going to serve 6 years because you both have this incentive, right? And so this is the problem with international relations when we're talking about should states conflict with each other? Should they go to war? And this is analogous to Robert Jervis's, who's also a very famous international relations guy, his what we call the security dilemma. And what happens usually is states obviously have to defend themselves, right? We have citizens. You have to have at least some rudimentary defenses. The problem is, as everyone starts doing that, there can be misinterpretations about whether your defensive weapons are actually offensive. There are misinterpretations about whether, like, your constant ramping up of military spending and things like this are actually aggressive instead of defensive. And so both sides eventually ramp up their defenses to match the other. And if that sort of relationship breaks down, or there's a misunderstanding, or there's some sort of, I don't know, incident with a citizen or something like that, then you'll get war, right? And no one ever intended to go to war. Both sides were only building up their defensive capabilities to protect their citizens, and yet we get conflict, right? And so this is very analogous to this prisoner's dilemma. Um, let's see. Okay, I'll finish the section 5 part, and then I'll pause it and I'll jump into the end. All right. Actually, no, we don't have too much to go. All right, section 5. Section 5C, excuse me, polarity. So polarity is a discussion of how many great powers are there in the system. And if you have a unipolar system, this is usually referred to as hegemony. You have the American hegemon, right? Or you can have like regional hegemons. And that was especially true historically because, we couldn't travel the globe. But even today, you could say, like, maybe Brazil's like a regional hegemon in its region, probably like Germany in Europe, China in Eastern Asia, this sort of thing, right? Um, um, but as we talked about earlier, you'll get sort of this balancing behavior. And when you have a rising hegemon or a rising competitor to the hegemon, then you'll get either coalitions and a balancing power of alliances, as you saw sort of pre-World War, pre-World War One, pre-World War Two, etc. Um, or you'll get war, as you're also seeing, right? Or as you also saw during those times. And the balancing behavior is supposed to, this sort of through alliance ships, is supposed to reduce the likelihood of war. But we saw that it actually increased the likelihood of World War One because sort of these promises they had made to each other forced particular states into the conflict. Okay, if you have a lot of power, you should have far more sort of competitive markets. There should be, and then if you have very few, you'll get sort of a monopolistic or an oligopolistic market. And some suggest that this is sort of the Bretton Woods system, which we'll talk about in a little while. All right, let's skip through 5D, the nature of structural predictions. We'll skip through 6A, motives matter. Okay, Section 6A, abstracting from or assuming motives. I just kind of wanted to run you through, like, there's a lot of different potential motives that we've discussed all the way throughout this lecture so far, but I kind of just wanted to poke them out because different realist theorists have different ideas about what the motive is. Um, some rooted in pure human nature, like the sort of the Hobbesian argument. Some rooted in the anarchic system, but those are like what causes these things. The motives in general have been competition and glory. I mean, I think that would be sort of a Hobbesian argument, and that would be like the mercantilist system that we lived on under from like the 1600s till say 1800, right? It's all about expansion and territorial conquering and the glory of military victory and all these sorts of things. Modern realists and modern economists tend to take a more like the power argument. It's all about national strategy. It's about relative power. It's about military technology and military training and all force projection and all of these sorts of things. And then you've got Homo economicus, which is like the enrichment of oneself. So this is all about sort of rational human behavior modeling, but you can sort of move that up to the state level as well. So just know there's a handful of different lenses through which this can be seen. Okay, we'll skip 6B, offensive and defensive realism. We really don't need to get into too much of the nuance at this point. We'll skip section 7, process institutions and change, and move to 7A, process variables. And there may be there are some contextualizations to be added to the neo-realist approach or the structural realism approach. And the suggestion from the author was alignment, right? Just assuming every state has the same exact relationship with your state. Let's just take the United States, for example. The assumption of the realist model that anarchy makes us see all states the same is just wrong, right? Um, I guess maybe 10 years ago I would have said that. Okay, maybe there's a point to it. But I was going to put the example of like Canada, right? I don't think the United States sees Canada as an enemy, especially if you talk about someone like Iran or China or Russia, right? Um, some of these states that share our international system, even despite anarchy, are are our allies, right? And so there need to be new sort of and there have been since this was written, there have been attempts to do this, but we need to understand that like seeing Canada rise is not a direct threat to the United States. And I don't think that most, I don't know, strategists or economists or etc. would ever see it that way. Like China is on the same exact um, possibility of being an enemy as Canada. And so there's some nuance here. And if you start taking in the idea of alliances versus enemies, right, you'll get better predictions about the behavior of states, even despite an anarchic system. Okay, and I should have pointed out, Section 7 is about some criticisms of the realist model. Okay, Section 7B, Norms, institutions, and identities. Again, this is a bit of a knock on the realist model in that um, there are norms in the international system for the most part. Norms against genocide, norms against, I don't know, violence against your own people. Um, what would be some other ones? Norms against sort of abuse of children or trafficking of children. Norms about sovereignty, even though those have been questioned, with like, man, I don't know, some of the ICJ arrests or the taking of Maduro in Venezuela. But there tend to be shared norms in the international system. You could point to the EU as a pretty good example. Yes, things aren't perfect. Don't get me wrong. I mean, you had Brexit, and things are far from perfect. But there are some shared norms, and so to just claim that everything is sort of zero sum and we have to see each other as enemies and all of these sorts of things, it doesn't take in the exact flavor of how international politics works. Okay, Section 7D, morality and foreign policy. So this was a pretty interesting theory, an interesting section, right? Because realism got a lot of criticism, especially moving out of sort of the 80s and 90s, that it didn't have to be as just robotic as it is. Like, we don't care about norms and morals. We must just, aggrandize our power at the international stage. And some theorists were arguing that. Don't get me wrong. Um, but that's a really thin view, right? Because you can actually benefit by following some norms. Um, and this is why we have things like treaties and alliances and international documents and the rest, right? Uh, and so the author disagrees with that whole perspective that like you can like it's all about power and you can't even consider morality, like the Machiavellian perspective, right? Um, and I would point out again the same sort of point I made earlier that Jean-Jacques Rousseau makes too, is that like humans don't always, you know, the assumption of Thomas Hobbes's just short, brutish, nasty life, right, isn't necessarily true. Not every human needs effective government or strong policing or whatever it might be to act in a moral way. Yes, society probably does, but not every human is just like deeply rotten to their core and based upon greed and self-aggrandizement, etc. And so the argument is that states don't have to act this way either. And we'll talk about some of the liberal argument for like when democracy is involved, you're far less likely to go to conflict. Um, but we also can point out some sort of just international norms of ethics, conventions against genocide, the Westphalian idea of sovereignty, again, even though that's a little squishy sometimes, humanitarian aid after disasters. Those are really hard to explain through the realist perspective or the realist lens. Why would we give $1 billion to Thailand after it gets hit by a tsunami? Well, because it's probably the right thing to do. 200,000 people drowned or something. And even with like HIV, why do we give retroviral drugs out in Africa? Uh, First of all, to help reduce the spread, but it can also pay back by not spreading to America, right? So I guess there is a little bit of national security involved in that. But I think you see what I'm saying here. There are also other possible constraints outside of morality, right? Like you have to mostly keep your allies pleased, or at least sort of play nice, right? Even when you disagree. You have international organizations and bilateral treaties and trade agreements and all of these sorts of things that can at least provide some stability and some vision for what are some shared agreements we can have. You've got your domestic audience, which we'll talk about pretty highly in the next chapter. Um, Democracies tend, first of all, not to go to war with each other, but second of all, not to really have the long term palette for war. Like they just start to see the horrors, and so your domestic audience can be very important, as maybe we're seeing with Iran right now. I think the American domestic audience is starting to get a little fed up with it, whereas Iran might be taking advantage of that thought. You've got international law, which it's squishy again. Countries tend to follow it when they want and not when they want, but for the most part, countries tend to follow the rules. Um, and yes, there may be no real true enforcement mechanism, um, but there are still costs of sort of breaking the norms of the international system, both from your allies, your domestic audiences, etc. So let's see. And I guess the last section, I just wanted to read you sort of the closing argument. Jack Donnelly says, realism simply fails to explain most of international relations. Anarchy, egoism, and the distribution of capabilities cannot explain the vast majority of what happens in such relations. And so realism is an excellent theory. It's a cool lens through which to look at things. Science is always about making simplified models to try and understand the world better, right? If you try to understand every single nuance that exists in the world, that's no longer science or modeling. Um, and you can't really learn anything from idiosyncrasy, right? So, as the author points out, like it is good to know this and to understand it and to be able to use the tool. Just don't think that it fits upon the world perfectly. Okay, that's all I got for you. That was a really long one. Sorry about that. I'll get liberalism up tonight, and then I will get the first paper up. Thanks for being here. I would say really focus on chapter 2, chapter 3. This is the core of this course. All right, thanks, guys.